I watched my winter stockpile burn down to black ash, while the HOA president stood there in her designer coat clipboard, tucked under her arm like she was inspecting landscaping. And my mom, 73, slipping deeper into dementia by the month, kept tugging my sleeve and whispering, "Where's my blue medicine box?" like the answer might suddenly appear in the flames. 4 of them were there, smiling, filming acting like they'd just solved some community crisis. And I remember thinking, yeah, that happened. This is real life, and somehow I'm the one who's supposed to stay polite. What they didn't know, what nobody in Timberline Cove seemed to remember, was that my family still controlled the spillway that regulated Clearbrook Lake, the same lake their luxury homes were built around. And the second I realized they were willing to burn an old woman's medication to make a point, something in me went cold and steady. My name's Cole Mercer, and I'm not some flashy guy with a perfect yard and a matching SUV. I work with heavy equipment and engines. I fix what breaks. I keep my hands busy because life doesn't care if you're tired. I live up in the foothills, near a little Idaho mountain town, where winter isn't a vibe. It's a threat. People move up here for the view, for the lake, for the quiet. Then act shocked. When a storm drops 2 feet of snow overnight, and the power flickers like a dying bulb. When you've got an elderly parent who can't remember what she ate for breakfast, you learn real fast that routine is survival and backup plans are love. I start prepping in August, no joke, because once October hits, the road can turn into a sheet of ice, and the store shelves can empty out in a day. I label everything for my mom: red for mornings, yellow for afternoons, blue for bedtime. And I keep the supplies in the same place every year, because she might forget my name, but she remembers the feeling of safety when her world looks familiar. Timberline Cove is the kind of community that likes to call itself exclusive, you know what I mean, built around Clearbrook Lake. Big glass windows facing the water private docks, heated driveways, people who say property value's the way. Church folks say, amen. My place sits a little uphill, not lakefront, and I'm fine with that. I've got a small house, a tool shed, a covered area where I keep my generator propane tanks and stacked firewood. It's not pretty, but it's clean organized, and it's the reason my mom and I can get through a hard winter without panic. That right there, the fact that I'm prepared, is what made the HOA notice me. It always starts small, too. A complaint about visual clutter, a note about community standards. Then suddenly you're dealing with people who act like a few stacked totes are a felony. The HOA president back then was Paige Holloway. Picture-perfect hair, perfect teeth, that sweet voice that somehow still sounds like a threat, like she's smiling while she's pushing you down a staircase. Her inner circle was the usual cast. Dylan Price, vice president. Loud confidence, new money energy, the type who talks over you and then says he's just being direct. Maren Sloan, the treasurer, always cheerful, always helpful. And yet every sentence she spoke sounded like it came with a price tag. And Wesley Hart, the secretary, former insurance guy, slick with paperwork, always holding a laptop like it was a badge. The first time Paige came to my door, it was barely after 6 in the morning. I was making coffee. My mom was sitting at the kitchen table staring at the snow like it was a TV show she didn't understand. I opened the door, and there's Paige with her clipboard. Dylan behind her, with his hands in his pockets like he owned my porch. Paige goes, "Good morning, Cole. We've had some concerns from the community about unsafe storage conditions on your property." I blinked at her, then at Dylan, and I said, "Concerns from who? My nearest neighbor's a good walk away." Dylan smirked and said, "Doesn't matter. Rules are rules. I asked Paige to show me the rule, like literally point to the covenant, the bylaw, the line that says I can't keep supplies for winter. Paige smiled and said, "We don't want this to get complicated, but if you don't comply, the HOA can take emergency action." Emergency abatement. Emergency abatement. That phrase should come with a warning label. It's what people say when they want to skip the part where you get a fair chance to respond. I told her calm as I could manage. If it's an emergency, call the fire marshal. If it's not, send me a written notice with the specific violation and the time frame, and I'll review it. Paige nodded like I'd just asked her for extra napkins, and she said, "Of course, Cole. You'll receive a notice." I figured that was it. I've dealt with inspectors, with permits, with city nonsense. I know how to keep my cool. What I didn't understand yet was that these people weren't actually worried about safety. They were worried about control, and I was an eyesore that reminded them not everything up here can be curated like a magazine spread. A few days later, I had to take my mom down the mountain for an appointment and to pick up prescriptions. We left before sunrise around 5:40, and it was one of those rare days where my mom was almost herself. She remembered the diner she liked. She hummed along to an old song. She laughed when the waitress called her hon. I remember thinking, please just let this day stay good. You learn not to ask for big miracles. You ask for small mercies. We got home mid-afternoon, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. Burnt plastic and chemicals, that sharp, choking stink that makes your stomach drop. I saw smoke rising from the back of my house, and 4 shiny cars parked out front like it was a party. I told my mom to stay in the car, and I ran. Behind my house, my supplies were piled into a metal burn bin and set on fire. Food water containers, medical kits, spare batteries, propane canisters, not the big ones. Thank God, but enough to matter. And right in the middle of it, I saw my mom's blue medication box starting to warp and melt. Paige stood there in a pale coat clipboard in hand, watching like she was supervising a volunteer cleanup. Dylan was grinning. Marin was recording on her phone. Wesley was talking about documentation like that made it okay. I shouted, "What the hell are you doing?" Paige turned toward me and said, sweet as sugar, "Cole, this is an emergency cleanup. We received reports of unsafe storage and fire hazards. We're acting in the community's best interest." Dylan lifted a hand like a bouncer and said, "Don't get close. Fire hazard." And right then, my mom stepped out of the car, slow and shaky because she heard my voice, and she panicked, and she started crying, like real crying. And she kept saying, "Cole, where's my blue box? Where's my blue box?" You want to talk about rage. Not the kind where you scream, but the kind where everything inside you turns into a hard, silent knot. I looked Paige dead in the face, and I said, "You are burning medication for an elderly woman. Show me the notice." Paige produced this flimsy paper like it was some magic shield and said it was posted on your door this morning. 72-hour notice under emergency abatement. I laughed and it didn't sound friendly. We left before 6. There was nothing on my door. Wesley said flat, "You must have missed it. It's valid." And that's when I realized what they were counting on. They were counting on me being too overwhelmed, too busy caring for my mom, too isolated to fight back. They wanted me desperate because desperate people sell. That's the part nobody tells you about HOA bullies. It's not about the grass height. It's about pressure. And pressure turns into profit if you know how to squeeze. The next morning, the squeeze started. 4 envelopes showed up certified mail from 4 different agencies. Fire marshal complaint about propane storage. Building code complaint about my generator hookup. Health department complaint about food storage. Environmental complaint about fuel containers. Each one had fees and deadlines and that lovely little detail about daily penalties. And every single complaint had the same tone, the same phrasing, like one person wrote them and just swapped letterhead. You know what I mean. Meanwhile, my mom kept asking about her medications. She didn't understand the HOA burned it. She just understood that her world got yanked out from under her, and nobody cared. The local pharmacy suddenly treated her prescriptions like they were suspicious. The hardware store got weird when I asked about propane. People who used to wave stopped making eye contact. My mom's home aide quit after someone left an anonymous message about unsafe conditions. Isolation isn't just emotional up here, it's physical. If the town turns on you, it can get dangerous fast. I had a couple nights where I sat at my kitchen table staring at the scorch marks behind my house, listening to my mom breathe in her room. And I'll be honest, I felt small. Not because I didn't know how to fight, but because fighting takes energy, and caregiving already takes everything. But then I remembered something my dad used to say when a job went sideways. If they're using the system to hit you, learn the system better than they do. So I did. I went to the county records office, sat in that dusty room with old maps and deed books, and I pulled every document I could find about Clearbrook Lake and Timberline Cove. Original development plans, floodplain maps, easements, permits, anything with a date and a signature. I started matching names, looking for patterns, and the longer I looked, the more ridiculous it got. Dylan's home had a massive heated driveway and a pool heater system that, from what I could tell, should have required permits. Page's place had a basement wine cellar and a backup generator setup that looked way bigger than mine. Marin's house was basically a short-term rental business with extra fuel storage and amenities. Wesley's place had a finished lower level that sat suspiciously close to the lake elevation. Then I found it. A recorded easement and a separate deed clause tied to the spillway that regulated Clearbrook Lake. And the name on that clause, Mercer, my family. Not the HOA, not the community. My family retained spillway control when the land was developed decades ago, a condition that never got transferred, which meant the HOA didn't control the lake the way they thought they did. They were living around a system they didn't own, and they were acting tough with the one guy who still had legal authority over the valve. Around that same time, my neighbor Hank Daly, old mountain guy lived here forever, came by and looked at the burned spot behind my house. He shook his head and said, "They did this on purpose, son. And you know they're dumb, right? Because they forgot who built half this place." He told me he remembered my dad working on the spillway system years ago, doing maintenance, keeping it from freezing up, keeping the water level safe during spring melt. Hank pointed toward the north end of the lake and said, "That spillway was always Mercer responsibility. Folks just stopped paying attention when money moved in." That night I went down to my basement and opened the old metal panel my dad had kept locked. Inside was a control setup that looked like it belonged in another era. Switches, gauges, labels in my dad's handwriting. Maintenance logs in a binder that smelled like oil and paper. I put my hand on that panel, and I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not revenge. Leverage. The kind you get when the law and reality happen to line up for once. I called a lawyer the next day, a water rights attorney named Dana Reeve. Dana wasn't dramatic. She read my documents, asked a few questions, and then said, "Cole, this is solid. You have operational authority under emergency drainage protocols. And with heavy snowpack and rapid warm-ups, you can justify spillway releases for public safety." I asked her, "What about those lakefront houses?" Dana slid a flood easement map across my table and tapped it with her finger. Some of these homes are sitting in a protected zone. If their elevation certificates are inaccurate, they've got bigger problems than HOA politics. Wesley Hart's name kept popping in my mind. Insurance guy. Paperwork guy. The kind of guy who knows exactly which forms make problems disappear. Suddenly, his calm little voice saying it's valid didn't sound like confidence. It sounded like experience. Like he'd done this before. And here's the part that made my stomach turn. Donna helped me look into property transfers over the last few years. 6 homes owned by older residents. People with health issues, people who didn't have the energy to fight, had been sold after HOA violations piled up. Same pattern. Complaints, fines, isolation, then a helpful offer to buy their house. The buyer was always some LLC with a clean name. But when we dug into it, the names connecting that LLC circled right back to Paige, Dylan, Marin, and Wesley. They weren't just controlling the community. They were running a pressure machine to scoop up properties cheap. So when Paige sent another notice, this time threatening a lien legal fees, even suggesting I was an unfit caregiver, and they might involve adult services, something in me snapped into clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was predatory. And my mom was the bait. Spring came late that year, and then it came all at once. The snowpack was heavy, and the forecast started calling for a sudden warm spell. Up here, that's when you pay attention. Warm days after deep snow can turn a calm lake into a problem fast. The county issued advisory notes about runoff. That gave me exactly what I needed. Not an excuse, but a legitimate reason to operate the spillway at higher capacity. Dana told me document everything. Photos, timestamps, logs. Do it by the book. So I did. I logged water levels. I photographed the gauges. I followed the protocol my dad wrote down years ago. Paige, of course, chose that exact window to schedule an emergency HOA hearing. She wanted a public spectacle. She wanted to paint me as the unstable hoarder endangering an elderly woman. She even arranged for local media and a community live stream, because bullies love an audience. They invited neighbors to come witness the process, like it was some civic service. You know what I mean. The morning of the hearing, the air felt wrong. Too warm, too fat snow dripping off roofs in steady streams. My mom sat in her chair and kept asking if everything was okay. I told her, "It's okay, Mom. I've got it." I went down to the basement, checked the panel, heard the hydraulic pump hum, and I set the spillway release to match the emergency runoff forecast. Not full open yet, just enough to keep lake levels from jumping too fast, and enough to prove I was actively managing conditions. At the community center by the lake, Paige stood at the front, like a queen holding court. Dylan leaned against the wall, smug. Marin sat with paperwork smiling like she already won. Wesley had his laptop open ready to prove things. Paige started talking about standards and safety and how she cared about residents. Then she pointed at me and said, "Cole Mercer has repeatedly violated community rules, created unsafe conditions, and has demonstrated behavior that raises concerns about his ability to care for an elderly dependent." I stood up and said, "You burned her medication. Don't use the word care in the same sentence as what you did." Paige smiled tightly and said, "We acted under emergency abatement authority." I said, "Show the valid notice with the timestamp and the posted proof." Wesley jumped in. "The notice is valid." I looked at him and said, "Wesley, you sure you want to stake your name on the word valid?" And right then, like the universe was sick of their arrogance, their phones started ringing. Paige's first, then Dylan's, then Marin's, then Wesley's. Paige answered, and her face drained. What do you mean the wine cellar's flooding? Dylan swore under his breath. My garage is taking on water. Marin made this strangled sound. The spa room is overflowing. Wesley went pale, like ghost pale, and whispered the storage, the files. The room exploded in murmurs. People stood up leaning to see what was happening. Paige slammed her phone down and shrieked, pointing at me. You did this on purpose. I didn't raise my voice. I held up my logbook and said, I'm operating the Spillway under emergency drainage protocol due to rapid snowmelt. I've documented levels forecasts and releases. This is public safety. Paige shouted, Stop it. I said I can't stop runoff. I can only manage it. And if your home is built where it shouldn't be, that's not something a clipboard can fix. Donna walked in at that moment with printed maps and documents, and she laid them on the table like she was setting down a verdict. These lakefront properties fall within a recorded easement zone. If elevation certificates were falsified, flood insurance may be void, and that becomes an investigation, not an HOA meeting. Wesley's eyes flicked to Paige, to Dylan, to Marin, like he was suddenly realizing he might be the one holding the bomb. Paige turned on Wesley. Hissing, You said we were protected. Wesley swallowed, and in the worst possible timing said, I only did what we agreed to. And you could feel the entire room freeze. Someone in the back said. Another voice said, Agreed to what? Then an older woman stood up and said, They did this to my father too. Fines, threats, then an offer to buy his home. A guy near the aisle said, I've seen that LLC name. The crowd wasn't listening to Paige anymore. The spell broke. The bully lost the room. Paige snapped. I'm the HOA president. And Hank Daly, calm as a rock, said from the back, Not after today, you're not. Paige looked around like she expected people to clap for her authority. Nobody did. All she had left was panic and the sound of her own phone ringing again. And then, like a final nail, a county official walked in with that no-nonsense posture, the kind you don't see at HOA meetings unless something serious is happening. He said, We need to review the spillway operation logs and the property elevation documentation for the lakefront parcels. We've received reports of irregularities. Paige opened her mouth, and no sound came out. Dylan stared at the floor. Marin gripped her folder like it was a life raft. Wesley looked like he might throw up. I stood there, and I'll be honest, my hands were shaking, but not from fear. From release. Because for months they'd made me feel like I was crazy for trying to keep my mom safe. They'd treated me like trash, because I wasn't pretty enough for their postcard community. They tried to weaponize paperwork against a man who knows how paperwork works, and they tried to crush an old woman's stability for profit. And at the end of it, the thing that took them down wasn't some dramatic punch. It was reality, water law, and their own greed. Now, before anyone starts typing, let me say this. I didn't flood anyone for fun. I operated the spillway during a legitimate emergency runoff window, and I documented it like my livelihood depended on it. Because it did. If their homes took damage, it's because they built too low, too close, too careless, and they depended on shady documents to pretend nature and easements didn't apply to them. But here's the controversial part, and I know it. If you were in my shoes watching your mom's medication burn, watching the community turn on you, watching bullies try to steal your home, would you still feel obligated to protect the homes of the people doing it? Or would you say, no, I'm going to do my job by the book, and whatever truth comes with that, so be it. You tell me. So I want you to weigh in down in the comments. Was what happened to Paige and her crew karma, or did I cross a line? If you lived in my neighborhood, would you have called me a villain? Or would you have finally seen what the HOA was really doing? And if you've ever dealt with a power-tripping HOA, or any kind of small-time authority that turned cruel the second they got a little control, share your story. I read more comments than you'd think, and I know a lot of you have been through some wild stuff. Hit like if you want more of these real-life justice stories. Subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one, and drop the word next if you want me to tell you what we found in Wesley's valid paperwork after the county started digging.